Well, at least Emma doesn't have to worry about getting laid off again. My mother's voice carried across the dining room with that particular lightness people use when they're pretending something cruel is actually funny, and I watched my sister Emma smile into her wine glass while my father chuckled and cut into his steak. I was 32 years old, sitting at my childhood dining table in their home in Sacramento, and I had just told them 3 days ago that I'd been let go from my marketing coordinator position at Henderson and Associates, a mid-sized firm downtown where I'd worked for 2 years. 2 years of decent performance reviews, of staying late and taking on extra projects, of building campaigns that actually moved metrics. And then one Friday afternoon meeting where they explained the department was restructuring and my role was being eliminated. And just like that, I was walking out with a cardboard box and a severance package that would cover exactly 6 weeks of living expenses. I'd told my family because I thought maybe, despite years of evidence to the contrary, they might offer support or encouragement or even just basic sympathy. Instead, I got this. Another Sunday dinner where I was the punchline. It's not like it's the first time Sarah's had to figure things out, Emma added, and there was no malice in her voice, which somehow made it worse. Just that casual dismissiveness that suggested my career struggles were as predictable as weather patterns. Emma was 29, 3 years younger than me, and she was an associate at a law firm in downtown San Francisco, living in a sleek apartment in Soma with her fiancé Derek, who worked in tech and wore expensive casual clothes that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She had always been the successful one, the golden child who met every expectation and exceeded it, while I was the one who couldn't quite get it together, at least according to the family narrative that had calcified over the years into something that felt like fact. The job market is tough right now, my father said, but his tone suggested he was making excuses for me, rather than acknowledging reality. I'm sure you'll find something eventually, Sarah. Maybe something more stable this time. More stable. As if I'd been bouncing between circus gigs and pyramid schemes instead of holding down legitimate marketing positions at legitimate companies. I felt the familiar tightness in my chest, that particular combination of hurt and frustration, and the exhausting awareness that defending myself would only make me look defensive. My mother passed the green beans and asked Emma about the wedding planning, and just like that, the conversation shifted to the important topic, the successful daughter's upcoming marriage. And I sat there pushing roasted potatoes around my plate and thinking about how I had exactly $3,400 in my savings account and no idea what I was going to do next, while my family had already moved on from my crisis because it simply wasn't interesting enough to hold their attention. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. The pattern had been set long before that Sunday dinner, carved into the foundation of our family dynamics like grooves worn into stone by years of water flowing in the same direction. And I remembered sitting at our kitchen table when I was 17, holding my acceptance letter to Sacramento State University with my hands actually shaking from excitement because I'd gotten in with a partial academic scholarship that would cover about 40% of tuition, and my mother had smiled that tight smile and said, "That's wonderful, honey," in the same tone she might have used if I'd told her I'd gotten a B+ on a math test. And then 2 years later, when Emma got her acceptance to Santa Clara University, a private school with tuition that was nearly 3 times what state cost, my parents had actually thrown a celebration dinner and invited the extended family. And my father had stood up with his wine glass and talked about how proud he was of his daughter, who was going to be a lawyer someday. And the difference wasn't subtle. It was a chasm. And when it came time to actually pay for college, my parents had sat me down and explained that they could contribute $5,000 toward my education, and I'd need to cover the rest with loans and work study, which I did. I took out nearly $40,000 in student loans and worked 20 hours a week at a campus bookstore and graduated with decent grades and that debt hanging around my neck. But when Emma went to Santa Clara 2 years later, they paid her full tuition, every single semester, nearly $180,000 over 4 years, and when I'd asked my mother about the discrepancy, she'd said something about their financial situation being better by then, and how they'd learned from their mistakes with me, as if funding my education had been a mistake they needed to correct by not repeating it. Now, sitting in my apartment 3 days after that Sunday dinner, scrolling through job listings on my laptop while my coffee went cold, I felt that old familiar weight of being the daughter who required less investment because she'd probably yield lower returns anyway, and my father called that afternoon, his voice carrying that forced cheerfulness that meant he was about to say something he thought was helpful. And he told me, "You know, Sarah, maybe this is an opportunity to finally find something really stable, something with a clear path forward." And the implication that I'd never had stability or clear path sat between us like a third presence on the call. And when I didn't respond immediately, he added, "Your mother and I were talking, and maybe you should reach out to Emma, get some career advice from her. She's got a good head for professional development." And I had actually laughed. A short, bitter sound that surprised both of us, because the idea that Emma, who'd had everything handed to her on a silver platter, could advise me on how to build something from nothing was so absurd it almost felt like satire, but I swallowed that response and said something noncommittal and got off the phone. And I sat there in my quiet apartment with my dwindling savings and my uncertain future, and I felt something shift inside me, not dramatic but definite, a small hardening of resolve that whispered I didn't need their validation or their advice or their carefully rationed support. I just needed to figure this out myself, the way I'd always had to figure everything out myself, and maybe then they'd finally see me as something other than the unsuccessful one. Though even as I thought it, I wondered why I still cared so much what they saw. The first freelance consulting gig came 2 weeks after my father suggested I ask Emma for career advice, and it arrived through a former colleague from Henderson and Associates named Marcus, who'd left 6 months before the layoffs and started his own small digital marketing firm. And he called me on a Wednesday afternoon and asked if I wanted to take on some overflow work for a local restaurant group that needed social media strategy, 15 hours a week at $75 an hour, and I said yes before he'd even finished explaining the scope, because $1,100 a week was $1,100 a week, and within 3 days I'd landed a second client through a contact from my old college internship, a boutique retail company that needed email marketing campaigns, another $800 a week, and suddenly I was making more than my unemployment benefits would have provided, and I was doing it on my own terms, working from my apartment in my comfortable clothes without anyone looking over my shoulder or scheduling pointless meetings. And the work itself felt good. Felt right in a way my corporate job never quite had, because these clients actually listened to my ideas and implemented my suggestions and told me I was making a difference to their bottom line. But when I went to Sunday dinner that week and my mother asked how the job search was going, I just said, "Still looking," because something in me had decided not to share this yet, not to offer up this tender new thing to a family that had spent years treating my professional life as an ongoing comedy of failures. I didn't tell them about the third client either, or the fourth, and by the end of that first month, I was making nearly $5,000, and I'd started putting together an actual business structure, filing for an LLC and setting up a separate bank account, and building a simple website. And through all of this, my family continued to operate on the assumption that I was struggling and floundering and probably spending my days in pajamas, scrolling through job boards. And I let them believe it, because their belief didn't matter anymore, or at least I was learning to make it not matter. Then, in early October, 2 months after my layoff, Emma called me, with her voice pitched high with excitement, to tell me that Derek had proposed. He'd done it at some vineyard in Napa with a photographer hidden in the bushes to capture the moment, and the ring had cost $15,000, which she told me with a breathless laugh, and she wanted to have an engagement party, and of course I'd be there, and the party was held at my parents' house 3 weeks later. A catered affair with probably 60 people crowded into their living room and backyard, with a bartender mixing signature cocktails and a table full of expensive appetizers and champagne flowing freely, and my parents had paid for all of it. My mother mentioned the cost to me in passing. $7,000, but she only gets engaged once. And I'd brought a gift, a nice picture frame from a home goods store that cost $45. And when Emma opened it in front of a cluster of her friends, my mother had touched my arm and said, "That's so thoughtful, honey, given your situation," with that particular tone of compassionate condescension that made my chest tight. And I'd smiled and nodded and felt that resolve inside me harden into something diamond bright and unbreakable. And I'd thought very clearly that I was going to prove them all wrong, but I was going to do it so quietly they wouldn't see it coming until it was already done. 3 months after my layoff, after Emma's engagement party, where my modest gift had been met with that patronizing comment about my situation, my freelance business had grown in ways I hadn't dared to hope for when I'd taken that first consulting gig from Marcus, and I was sitting at my desk on a gray November morning when I got the email from Adriana Summers, the founder of a boutique firm called Meridian Strategies that specialized in sustainable products marketing, and she'd been referred to me by one of my smaller clients who'd been thrilled with the campaign I'd designed for them. And after a single phone conversation where Adriana asked sharp, insightful questions and actually listened to my answers instead of just waiting for her turn to talk, she offered me a monthly retainer of $8,000 to handle their entire digital marketing strategy. And I'd had to mute myself for a moment, because $8,000 a month was $96,000 a year from a single client. And when I added that to the steady income flowing in from my other 5 clients, I was suddenly looking at an annual income of approximately $115,000, which was not only substantially more than the $68,000 I'd been making at Henderson and Associates before they laid me off, but was also more than Emma's $95,000 salary as a third-year associate at her law firm. A number I knew because she'd mentioned it at a family dinner 6 months ago, with that particular blend of pride and false modesty that made it sound like she was being humble while actually bragging. I signed Meridian's contract that afternoon, my hands steady as I typed my name, and I sat back in my chair and felt something enormous settle in my chest. Not triumph exactly, but a quiet, solid certainty that I'd been right to trust myself, right to build this thing brick by brick without their support or encouragement, or even their awareness. And I transferred money into my savings account and watched the balance grow and started actually paying down my student loans with aggressive payments instead of the minimums I'd been scraping together for years. And through all of this, I kept living in my modest one-bedroom apartment and driving my 7-year-old Honda and buying my clothes from the same mid-range stores I'd always shopped at because I was saving with a focus that felt almost religious, building a foundation that no one could kick out from under me. And on Sundays, I still went to family dinners where my father would ask vague questions about my job search, and my mother would suggest I look into administrative positions because they were stable, and Emma would occasionally throw me pitying looks across the table while discussing her cases and her condo hunt with Derek and their plans for the future. And I would sit there eating my mother's pot roast and making non-committal responses and holding this enormous secret inside me like a pearl. And I realized I wasn't keeping quiet out of shame anymore or fear of their judgment. I was keeping quiet because their opinion of me had become irrelevant to my actual life, and that shift felt more significant than any number in my bank account ever could. Emma's wedding planning consumed every family gathering like a wildfire eating oxygen. And from December through March, every Sunday dinner and every holiday visit and every phone call from my mother became entirely about venues and caterers and flower arrangements and dress fittings, and I watched from my usual position at the margins as my parents threw themselves into planning what my mother kept calling the event of the year, and I was included in these conversations only in the most peripheral way, assigned small, meaningless tasks that made it clear I was there to fill a bridesmaid slot rather than to actually participate in anything important. Emma asked me to be a bridesmaid in late November with a text message that said, "You'll be in the wedding, obviously. I'll send you the dress info." And when the actual planning started, I was given exactly one responsibility, which Emma announced at a January dinner with that bright false enthusiasm she used when she was being generous to lesser beings. Sarah, since you have so much free time with your schedule, maybe you could put together the reception playlist. Nothing too complicated, just something fun and danceable. And my mother had nodded enthusiastically and added, "That's perfect. Sarah's always been good with that creative stuff," in a tone that made creative stuff sound like a consolation prize for people who couldn't handle real achievement. The wedding budget became a constant topic of discussion, my parents announcing in various ways at various gatherings that they were paying for everything, the entire $45,000 affair, and my father said more than once that, "You do this for your children, when they're building their lives, when they're settling down into something permanent." And the implication hung in the air unspoken, but obvious that this was an investment they were making in Emma's successful, stable future. And the parallel implication, equally unspoken, was that they wouldn't need to make this kind of investment in me, because I would probably have something small, something modest, something that matched my smaller, more modest life. I sat through conversations about the $8,000 photography package and the $12,000 catering contract and the $3,000 cake and the custom invitations and the designer dress and the honeymoon in Bali that Derek's parents were contributing $10,000 toward, and I made appropriate appreciative noises and I worked on the playlist they'd assigned me like a homework project. And inside, I felt that diamond-hard resolve growing denser and brighter, because I was saving more than $3,000 a month by this point, and I had started looking at real estate listings in my spare time, and I had begun to understand that their dismissal of me had become the fuel for my success, that every casual cruelty was another reason to build something they couldn't diminish. And I thought sometimes that I should feel grateful to them for underestimating me so completely, because their low expectations had given me the freedom to exceed every measure of success they'd denied I could reach. 6 months after my layoff, in early April when the cherry blossoms were starting to bloom along the streets of my neighborhood, and I was walking to my favorite coffee shop on a Saturday morning feeling more financially secure than I'd ever felt in my adult life, I checked my bank accounts on my phone and saw that I'd crossed a threshold I'd been working towards since November, $35,000 in my emergency fund. A number that felt both enormous and hard-won because I'd built it dollar by dollar while simultaneously paying off the last of my credit card debt from my lean years and making aggressive payments on my student loans, and my annual income had climbed to approximately $140,000 as I'd added 2 more mid-sized clients to my roster, and Meridian had increased my retainer by $1,000 monthly after the campaign I'd designed for them exceeded all their projections. And it was that same Saturday afternoon when I got a text from Jason Park, a former colleague from Henderson and Associates, who'd been laid off in the same round as me, and who I'd stayed in touch with over coffee meetings every few weeks. His message said, "Call me when you can. I have a proposal that might interest you." And when I called him an hour later, he laid out an idea that made my heart race with equal parts excitement and terror. He wanted to start a full-service marketing agency with me as partner. He'd been doing freelance work too and had landed some impressive clients, and he'd been thinking about this for months, and he believed we could build something substantial if we combined our client bases and our expertise and our networks. And I told him I needed time to think about it, because it was one thing to freelance safely from my apartment, and another thing entirely, to commit to building an actual business with overhead and employees, and all the risk that entailed. But even as I said I needed time, I could feel something shifting in my chest, some recognition that this was the next step I'd been unconsciously preparing for. That Sunday at family dinner, my father asked me across the table in that tone of vague concern he used when he was trying to show parental interest without actual investment, "Are you still doing that computer stuff, Sarah?" And I said, "It's marketing strategy, Dad, and yes." And he nodded the way you'd nod at a child's hobby and said, "Well, good, good, as long as it's keeping you busy." And before I could respond, Emma announced with barely contained excitement that she and Derek had bought a condo, a beautiful 2-bedroom in Lincoln Park with hardwood floors and a balcony and updated appliances. And my mother actually gasped with joy, and my father raised his wine glass in a toast, and Emma explained that they'd been able to afford it because my parents had helped them with the $30,000 down payment, an early wedding gift, they said. And everyone congratulated them and asked questions about square footage and HOA fees and closing dates. And not a single person asked me if I needed help with anything, or how my business was going, or whether I had any plans for the future. And I sat there eating my roasted chicken and feeling that familiar hot knot in my chest that I'd learned to recognize as a mixture of hurt and rage, and something harder and colder that might have been determination. And I realized that Jason's proposal wasn't scary at all. It was exactly what I needed to do. Because these people would never see me as successful, no matter what I achieved on my own. So I might as well achieve something so undeniable that their blindness became irrelevant. I called Jason on Monday morning and told him I was in, that I wanted to build the agency with him, and we spent the next 3 weeks in a blur of activity that felt both terrifying and exhilarating, filing LLC paperwork and opening business bank accounts and building a website and crafting pitch decks and reaching out to our networks. And we named it Catalyst Marketing Group because Jason said we were catalyzing change for our clients, and I thought privately that I was catalyzing change for myself too, burning down the old version of Sarah who waited for her family's approval and building something new from the ashes. We combined our existing client rosters, which gave us immediate cash flow and credibility, and in late April, we landed our first major corporate client together, a national retail chain that was rebranding and needed a complete marketing strategy overhaul, and they signed a contract worth $150,000 annually. And when Jason and I sat in my apartment after the contract was signed and did the math on what this meant for our projected income, I felt something like vertigo, because my share of the agency profits combined with my existing retained clients meant I was looking at approximately $180,000 in annual income, and I had to read the numbers 3 times before I could believe them. Before I could accept that I had somehow built something that exceeded every definition of success my family had denied I was capable of reaching. I started looking at condos seriously in early May, scrolling through listings late at night and saving my favorites and calculating mortgage payments and imagining myself in spaces that were mine, that I'd bought with money I'd earned through work my family didn't even understand. And I felt powerful in a way I'd never felt before. Not the borrowed power of my parents' approval or my sister's reflected glory, but something solid and self-generated that came from knowing I'd built this entirely on my own. Emma's bachelorette party happened on a Saturday in mid-May, a weekend trip to a spa resort 2 hours outside the city that cost each bridesmaid $400. And I went because refusing would have caused questions I wasn't ready to answer. And I spent 2 days watching Emma hold court among her lawyer friends, women with neat professional lives and engagement rings and careful ambitions. And I endured conversation after conversation where these women asked me what I did with that particular tone that expected to hear something disappointing. And when I said I ran a marketing agency, I saw them process the word agency as if I'd said hobby or attempt. And one of them, named Jessica, who worked at Emma's firm, said, "Oh, that's so brave, just trying different things until something sticks. I really admire people who can handle that kind of uncertainty." And I smiled and thanked her and thought about the contract I'd signed 3 weeks earlier and said nothing, because I was learning that silence in the face of their assumptions was its own kind of power, that letting them underestimate me was a gift I was giving myself. 2 months before Emma's wedding, in late June, when the summer heat was making the city feel thick and sluggish, and I was sitting in a converted warehouse office space that Jason and I had just leased for Catalyst Marketing Group, I closed another major deal with a tech startup that needed a complete go-to-market strategy, a contract worth $90,000 that brought our agency's total annual billings to over $400,000 and meant that my personal income was now solidly established at $185,000 annually. And that same week, I got the call from my mortgage broker that I'd been pre-approved for a loan on a $380,000 condo in a neighborhood I'd always dreamed of living in. A sun-filled 2-bedroom unit with exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows and a kitchen with granite countertops that I'd fallen in love with the moment I walked through it. And I'd be putting down $75,000 that I'd saved entirely myself, And when the broker congratulated me on my financial position, I felt something crack open in my chest. Some recognition that I'd become the person I'd always hoped I could be, without anyone in my family noticing or caring, or even asking. I kept all of this information private, locked away like a secret treasure, because I'd learned over the past 8 months that my success existed in inverse proportion to their awareness of it, that the less they knew, the more purely mine it remained, untainted by their dismissal or their retroactive attempts to claim credit for supporting me. The first Sunday in July, we had a family gathering at my parents' house for my Uncle Martin's birthday. One of those afternoon events with too much food and too many people, and the particular suffocating quality that came from being surrounded by relatives who thought they knew you. And Uncle Martin, who'd always been kind to me in a distant way, asked me how work was going. And before I could answer, Emma interrupted from across the patio table with, "She's freelancing," in that tone people use when they're explaining something slightly embarrassing on someone else's behalf. The way you might say, "He's between opportunities," or "She's figuring things out." And my mother quickly changed the subject to Emma's wedding details, the final menu selections, and the florist's delivery schedule, and whether the string quartet needed a covered area. And my father looked at me with that expression of vague concern he'd perfected over the years and said, "You know, Sarah, you really should think about getting back into a real job with benefits, health insurance, and retirement matching and stability. This freelance thing is fine for now, but you need to think long term." And I sat there holding my glass of iced tea and feeling the words I could say building up behind my teeth like pressure. I could tell him that I had better health insurance than I'd ever had at Henderson and Associates, that I was contributing more to my retirement accounts than I ever had before, that I'd built something more stable in 8 months than most people build in years, but instead I just nodded and said, "I'll think about that, Dad," and watched him look satisfied that he'd fulfilled his parental duty by offering advice to his struggling younger daughter. And I thought about the pre-approval letter in my email inbox and the condo I'd be closing on in 6 weeks, and felt something settle in my bones, some deep knowledge that their perception of me had nothing to do with my reality and everything to do with their need to maintain a story where Emma was the successful one and I was the one who needed guidance. Emma's wedding week arrived in late August when the city was humid and golden, and I'd taken 5 full days off from Catalyst Marketing Group to fulfill my bridesmaid duties. And I'd left Jason managing our accounts and feeling the strange dissonance between the professional life I'd built, where I was valued and respected, and the family role I was returning to, where I was still treated as the disappointing sister who needed their patience and guidance. The week started with errands my mother assigned me, picking up programs from the printer and transporting centerpieces from the florist and confirming delivery times with vendors. Menial tasks that Emma's other bridesmaids weren't asked to do because they had real jobs they couldn't take time off from. And when I pointed out that I'd also taken time off from work, my mother said, "Yes, but your schedule is more flexible, honey. You can make up the hours whenever," with that smile that was supposed to soften the dismissal, but only made it sharper. Wednesday afternoon, I was at my parents' house helping arrange welcome bags for out-of-town guests when I overheard my mother in the kitchen talking to my Aunt Linda who'd flown in from Oregon. And my mother was saying, "Emma's just so settled now, you know, the career and the husband and the condo. We're so proud of how she's built her life." And there was a pause before she continued, "Sarah's still finding her way, but we're hopeful. At least one daughter turned out exactly as we'd hoped." And I stood there in the dining room with my hands full of tissue paper and local restaurant guides and felt something cold settle in my chest. Not surprise because I'd heard variations of this my entire life, but a clarifying anger that made everything sharp and bright. Thursday was the rehearsal and dinner where I walked through my role of standing to the left and holding Emma's bouquet and smiling on cue, and at the dinner afterward, at an expensive Italian restaurant that my parents were paying for. I sat at the end of the long table and watched my father give an impromptu toast about Emma's achievements and her wonderful choices, and how he and my mother had always known she'd find success and happiness. And he didn't mention me at all, except at the very end when he said, "And we know Sarah will figure things out eventually too," which got sympathetic chuckles from the relatives who saw me as the family project. The one who needed encouragement and patience while she stumbled toward an approximation of her sister's success. Friday was the full wedding day preparation, hair and makeup starting at 7 in the morning at the hotel where Emma was getting ready, and I sat in the salon chair and let them curl my hair and paint my face while Emma's friends chattered about their jobs and their relationships and their ambitious plans, and I thought about the condo closing that was scheduled for 2 weeks from now, and the Fortune 500 company that Jason and I were pitching next month, and felt this growing sense that I was living in two completely different realities, and I was letting my family continue to exist in the false one, because revealing the truth felt like giving them something they didn't deserve, like offering proof of my worth to people who should have assumed it all along. The wedding day itself was Saturday in late August, at a waterfront venue 40 minutes outside the city, one of those places with manicured lawns and a white pavilion and views of the harbor that cost my parents $12,000 just for the venue rental. And I fulfilled my bridesmaid duties quietly and efficiently, standing where I was told to stand and smiling when I was supposed to smile, and holding Emma's bouquet during the vows, while watching my sister marry a man I barely knew because no one had thought to include me in their relationship in any meaningful way. The reception was lavish in exactly the way my parents had wanted. 150 guests seated at tables with silk linens and elaborate floral centerpieces, a live band playing jazz standards, an open bar serving top-shelf liquor, plates of filet mignon and Chilean sea bass, and during dinner my father stood to give a toast that went on for 7 minutes about Emma's achievements and her intelligence and her drive, how she'd graduated top of her law school class and landed a position at a prestigious firm and found a wonderful husband who matched her ambition, how he and my mother had always known Emma would find this kind of success and stability because she'd always been focused and determined and clear about what she wanted. And then at the very end, almost as an afterthought, he raised his glass and said, "And of course we're hoping Sarah finds her path too. We know she's still figuring things out and we have faith she'll get there eventually." Which got sympathetic smiles from relatives and Emma's friends, who all turned to look at me with expressions of gentle encouragement, like I was a struggling student who just needed more time, and I sat there in my bridesmaid dress that cost $200 that I'd paid for myself, and felt my hurt and anger mounting like a tide, felt it rising in my chest and my throat until I could barely breathe. After dinner, when dancing started, I stood near the edge of the dance floor, holding a glass of champagne. I wasn't drinking, and Emma's friends cycled through conversations with me, these lawyer women in expensive dresses who asked, "So what do you do, Sarah?" with that particular tone of barely concealed pity, and when I said, "I run a marketing agency," they nodded with expressions that said they thought I was embellishing freelance work with an impressive title, and one of them named Jessica said, "That's great that you're staying positive and entrepreneurial. It's so brave to keep trying different things until something sticks." And another named Lauren said, "Emma mentioned you've had a rough year, but these things work out eventually. You just have to stay persistent." And I stood there being patronized by women who didn't know me at all, who only knew the story Emma had told them about her struggling younger sister. And I felt something crystallize inside me, some recognition that the breaking point I'd been approaching all week had finally arrived, and whatever came next would change everything. The day after the wedding, I woke up in my apartment exhausted and hollowed out from the previous 24 hours of performing the role of supportive sister while being treated like the family disappointment. And I'd planned to spend Sunday recovering alone with takeout and a book. But my mother called at 9 in the morning to say they were having brunch at the house at 11, and I was expected to be there because Emma and her new husband were coming before they left for their honeymoon to Bali the next morning. I almost said no, almost claimed I was sick or busy or just too tired, but some old pattern of obligation made me say yes, and at 10:45, I was driving to my parents' house in the suburbs feeling this bone-deep weariness that wasn't just physical, but emotional. The lay of years of being diminished and dismissed and treated as less than. When I arrived, everyone was already there. My parents and Emma and her husband Marcus sitting around the kitchen table that was covered with bagels and fruit and coffee, and they all looked tired too, but in that satisfied way people do after a successful event, like the exhaustion was worth it, because everything had gone exactly as planned. My mother hugged me and said, "Wasn't yesterday just perfect?" And I agreed that it had been beautiful because what else could I say? And I sat down at the table and poured myself coffee and listened to them recap moments from the reception and laugh about my uncle getting too drunk during the father-daughter dance and discuss which guests had said what. The conversation was easy and casual for about 20 minutes. Normal family talk that almost made me forget the toast and the pitying looks and Emma's friends patronizing me on the dance floor. And then Emma exchanged a look with Marcus, and her expression shifted to something more serious, and she said, "So we need to talk about something," in that tone people use when they're about to ask for something significant. I felt my stomach tighten with instinctive wariness, but I just looked at her and waited, and Marcus cleared his throat and said, "We've run into a bit of a situation with some of the wedding costs and the honeymoon," and Emma continued, "The final numbers came in higher than we budgeted, and with the condo down payment we took from Mom and Dad earlier this year, we've kind of maxed out what we can ask from them. And we're about $12,000 short on covering the honeymoon upgrade we booked and some of the vendor final payments that came in over estimate." I sat there holding my coffee mug and processing what I was hearing. The words themselves clear enough, but the implications still forming in my mind. And Emma looked directly at me with an expression that was trying for apologetic, but came across as expectant, and said, "We were hoping you could help us out, Sarah. It's family after all, and we wouldn't ask if it wasn't important." And in that moment, I understood with perfect clarity that they had planned this request, had discussed it among themselves, and decided that I was the solution to their financial miscalculation, and the sheer entitlement of it took my breath away. Emma looked directly at me across the kitchen table with an expression that was trying to be sisterly and warm, but couldn't quite hide the expectation underneath. And she said, "We were hoping you could help us out, Sarah. It's family." And those last two words hung in the air like they were supposed to be the entire argument, like invoking family was meant to end any possible resistance before it could begin. I sat there stunned into silence, my coffee mug frozen halfway between the table and my mouth, trying to process the enormity of what they were actually asking, and in that moment of my shocked quiet, my mother jumped in as if my hesitation needed to be managed quickly before it turned into refusal. "Sarah, honey, you don't have many expenses right now," she said in that reasonable tone she used when she wanted to make something sound logical and inevitable. "And Emma has real established life expenses, the condo fees and utilities and her student loans. She and Marcus are really stretched thin with building their life together." My father nodded along like this made perfect sense and added, "Consider it an investment in your sister's happiness, Sarah. This is her honeymoon we're talking about. These are memories that last a lifetime. And family helps family in important moments like this. She'd do it for you if positions were reversed." Emma was watching me with this look of patient expectation, like she was waiting for me to finish processing so we could move on to the logistics of the transfer. And Marcus looked vaguely uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to say anything. And Emma continued, "We'll pay you back eventually, obviously, once we're more settled, and Marcus's promotion comes through probably next year. We're not asking for a gift, just a loan to get us through this cash flow issue." The entitlement radiating from all of them was staggering, this absolute assumption that my money was available for their use, that my savings existed as a backup fund for their poor planning, that $12,000 was just something I could hand over because what else would I be using it for? And I realized they had discussed this among themselves and decided unanimously that asking me was reasonable, that I was the solution to a problem they'd created by overspending on a wedding and honeymoon upgrade and not budgeting properly. My mother reached across the table and patted my hand like she was comforting a child who needed guidance and said, "I know it seems like a lot, sweetie, but you're young and single, and you don't have the same financial obligations Emma does. You can rebuild savings, But Emma only gets one honeymoon, one chance to start her marriage right. And my father added, if you don't have the cash on hand, you could put it on a credit card, spread the payments out. We're not asking you to come up with it all this second. And I sat there understanding, with perfect clarity, that they genuinely believed I should go into debt to fund my sister's luxury vacation, that this was a reasonable thing to expect from me. And something inside me that had been bending for years finally stopped bending and turned to steel. I found my voice finally, though it took several seconds of heavy silence before I could make my mouth form words. And I said, let me make sure I understand this correctly, with a calmness I didn't feel, but that came from some deep place of self-preservation. You're $12,000 short on your honeymoon and wedding expenses because you went over budget, and you want me to give you that money to cover the difference? Emma nodded like I was finally catching on and said, exactly. We knew you'd understand once we explained it properly. It's really just a timing issue for us. And I continued in that same eerily calm voice. And this is for the upgraded honeymoon package, not the original one you'd planned? Marcus shifted uncomfortably and said, we found a better resort with the overwater bungalows, and we'd already told everyone that's where we were going, so we couldn't really downgrade. And the absurdity of that statement, the idea that social embarrassment justified $12,000 of someone else's money, nearly made me laugh. I asked, and the vendor overages, what were those for? And Emma waved her hand dismissively and said, the florist added extra arrangements we didn't initially discuss, and the photographer's album upgrade, and the reception ran over by an hour, so there was an overtime charge, just normal wedding stuff that added up. Normal wedding stuff that added up to thousands of dollars they expected me to pay. My mother was watching me with this encouraging expression, like she was waiting for me to do the right thing, and my father had that stern look he got when he expected compliance, and Emma was sitting there with Marcus looking at me like this was essentially already decided, and we were just working through the formalities. I asked, and you genuinely expect me to drain my savings to fund your luxury honeymoon upgrade and wedding overages? And Emma actually looked offended and said, it's not like you have major expenses right now, Sarah. You're renting a small apartment and you don't have a car payment or student loans anymore, or a mortgage or any of the things Marcus and I are juggling. You have time to make more money. You're freelancing so you can just take on extra projects. But we're building our future and we need this foundation to be solid. The statement was so breathtakingly entitled that I actually felt dizzy for a moment. She genuinely believed that because I was single and renting, I was just accumulating money with nothing important to spend it on, that my savings were less valid than her wants, that my financial goals were less real than her immediate desires. My mother added, honey, if you don't have the full amount in cash right now, you could put some on a credit card and maybe pay some from savings. We're flexible about how you structure it. We just need you to commit to helping. And I realized with perfect crystalline clarity that they had no intention of paying me back, that eventually meant never, that this was actually a request for a gift they were framing as a loan to make it easier for me to say yes. And my decision crystallized in that moment with an almost audible click of certainty, a feeling of stepping fully into myself for the first time in their presence in longer than I could remember. I said no. And the word came out clear and firm and landed in the middle of the kitchen table, like I'd dropped something breakable that shattered into pieces they hadn't expected. And the stunned silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the refrigerator humming in the corner and the clock ticking on the wall. Emma stared at me with her mouth slightly open like I'd spoken in a foreign language she couldn't quite parse. And then she said, "What do you mean, no?" With genuine confusion in her voice, like the word itself didn't make sense in this context, like she'd asked me to pass the salt and I'd refused. I looked directly at her and said, I mean, I'm not giving you $12,000. I'm not funding your honeymoon upgrade or your wedding overages. I'm saying no. And I watched the confusion on her face shift into something harder and more defensive. My mother's expression went tight and disapproving in that way that had made me feel small my entire childhood, and she said, "Sarah, don't be selfish. Family helps family. This is what we do for each other in times of need." And I felt something that had been coiled tight in my chest for years start to unfurl and straighten. "That's interesting," I said with a calmness that surprised even me. "Because when I lost my job 8 months ago, no one offered help, no one asked if I needed anything, no one checked if I was okay financially. What I got was jokes about being the unsuccessful one and suggestions that I ask Emma for career advice." My father's face reddened slightly and he said, "That was different, Sarah. You're young and single. You don't have the same responsibilities Emma does. She has a husband and a mortgage and an established life. These are real adult obligations." And the implication that my life was somehow less real, less valid, less worthy of consideration hit me like it always did. But this time, instead of making me feel small, it made me feel clarified. I watched Emma exchange a look with Marcus, that married couple telepathy that said they were dealing with an unreasonable person, and I felt the rage that had been building for months giving way to something colder and clearer, something that felt like seeing everything in sharp focus for the first time. My mother tried again with, "Honey, we're not asking you to do anything unreasonable. We're asking you to help your sister in an important moment, to prioritize family over your own personal wants." And I realized she genuinely believed my savings were personal wants, while Emma's luxury honeymoon was a legitimate need, that in their minds there was a hierarchy of worthiness, and I would always be at the bottom of it. And that understanding settled into my bones with a weight that felt almost like relief, because at least now I was seeing clearly what had always been true. Emma's face went from confused to defensive, and she said, "You're really going to ruin my honeymoon over this? You're really going to be that petty?" And her voice had taken on that sharp edge she got when things weren't going her way. And I felt something shift in me, a decision clicking into place that I hadn't fully realized I was making until the words were already forming. "What else are you possibly spending money on that's so important you can't help your own sister?" she demanded, and Marcus nodded beside her like this was a reasonable question, like my financial life was something they had a right to audit and approve. And I looked at all four of them sitting there in my parents' kitchen, with their expressions ranging from disapproval to entitlement, and I made my choice. "Actually," I said with a calmness that felt like stepping off a cliff, "I'm spending it on my mortgage." The confusion that crossed their faces was almost comical, like I'd just told them I was spending it on a trip to Mars, and my mother said, "What mortgage? You rent that apartment," with genuine bewilderment in her voice. I let the moment stretch out for a few seconds, let them sit in their confusion, and then I said, "I'm closing on a $380,000 condo next month downtown, 2-bedroom with a balcony and a view of the river, and I'm putting down $75,000. The silence that followed was different from before, heavier and more complete. And I watched their faces cycle through disbelief and shock, and something that might have been the first stirring of understanding that they had fundamentally misunderstood my situation. Emma recovered first and said, "What? How?" with an almost aggressive confusion, like my having money was somehow a personal offense, and Marcus was staring at me like he was recalculating everything he'd assumed about his new sister-in-law. My father's face had gone carefully blank in that way he did when processing information he didn't like, and my mother's mouth was slightly open like she wanted to speak, but couldn't quite figure out what to say. "My business," I said clearly, letting each word land with weight. "The freelancing you all dismissed, the computer stuff Dad asked about, the thing you all treated like a hobby I was playing at while I figured out my real career." I watched Emma's face flush and said, "The consulting agency I started 7 months ago with my former colleague, the one that now has 6 corporate clients on retainer, the business that's been thriving while you all assumed I was struggling." My mother found her voice and said, "Why didn't you tell us?" with something that might have been hurt in her tone, and I felt a laugh bubble up in my chest that came out sounding harder than I intended. "When?" I said, and my voice came out harder than I'd intended, but I didn't soften it, didn't take it back. When exactly should I have told you? Between the jokes at family dinners about me being the unsuccessful one, or during Emma's engagement party when Mom told everyone I was still figuring things out, or maybe at the wedding rehearsal when Dad said he hoped I'd find my path someday. I watched my mother's face flush, and she opened her mouth to respond, but I kept going because 8 months of silence had built up a pressure that was finally releasing. My annual income is now $183,000, I said clearly, letting each word land with precision. The agency I co-founded 7 months ago has 6 corporate clients on retainer, including 2 Fortune 500 companies. We're billing over $400,000 annually, and my 50% split, plus my individual consulting contracts, puts me at $183,000. Emma's face had gone pale, and then red, and Marcus was staring at me like I was a stranger. And my father said, "That's not possible," in a voice that suggested I must be lying or confused about basic mathematics. "It's extremely possible," I said. "I have the contracts, the bank statements, the tax projections from my accountant. It's all documented and verified and very, very real." My mother made a small sound and said, "But you never said anything. You let us think you were struggling." And I felt something sharp twist in my chest. "I didn't let you think anything," I said. "You assumed I was struggling because that fit the narrative you'd constructed about me, the one where Emma is the successful daughter and I'm the one who can't get her life together, and nothing I said or did was going to change that narrative, so I stopped trying." I looked at Emma directly and said, "I have $80,000 in savings. I paid off my student loans 3 months ago. I have a retirement account and an investment portfolio and excellent credit. I've been financially stable since March and thriving since June." Emma found her voice, and it came out strangled. "You've been lying to us for months." I shook my head slowly. "I haven't lied about a single thing. I just stopped volunteering information to people who made it clear they weren't interested. When Dad asked if I was still doing that computer stuff, I said yes, because I am still doing it. When you told your friends I was freelancing, that was accurate because I am freelancing. You all just decided what those things meant without ever asking for details." My father's expression had shifted into something defensive, and he said, "We always believed in you, Sarah. We always supported your choices even when they seemed unconventional." And I actually laughed, a short, sharp sound that made my mother flinch. "No," I said flatly. "No, you didn't. You've spent years making it clear that my choices were inferior to Emma's, that my life was less valid, less successful, less worthy of respect and celebration. So please don't rewrite history now that you've discovered I'm not actually the failure you thought I was." Emma's face had gone through shock and disbelief, and now landed on something that looked like anger. That familiar expression she got when things weren't going her way, and someone needed to be blamed for it. And she said, "So you were lying to us? You were pretending to struggle while you had all this money?" Her voice had taken on that accusatory tone that used to make me scramble to defend myself, to explain, to make things right, but I felt none of that old reflex now, and I said, "I wasn't lying. I just stopped sharing because you all stopped listening years ago. There's a difference between lying and declining to volunteer information to people who've made it clear they're not interested." I watched her face flush darker and continued. "When was the last time any of you asked me a genuine question about my work? Not a dismissive comment or a suggestion that I get a real job, but an actual interested question about what I do or how it's going?" The silence that followed was answer enough, and I started listing examples because suddenly I wanted them to hear it, to understand the pattern they'd created. At Christmas dinner, Dad asked if I was still doing that computer stuff, and when I said yes, he changed the subject to Emma's caseload. At your engagement party, Mom told her book club friends I was between opportunities, which wasn't remotely true. At the bridal shower, your friend Jessica asked what I did, and you answered for me that I was freelancing and doing some consulting, which was technically accurate, but you said it in that tone that made it clear you thought it was nothing serious. Emma tried to interrupt, but I kept going because each example was rising up in my memory with perfect clarity. At the rehearsal dinner, Uncle Bob asked about my career, and you literally interrupted to talk about your promotion. At Sunday dinners for the past 8 months, whenever anyone asked about me, the conversation got redirected within 30 seconds. You've treated my entire professional life like something embarrassing that polite people don't discuss. My mother made a sound of protest and said, "Sarah, let's not be dramatic. We've always been interested in your life." And I felt something sharp and clear cut through me. "I'm not being dramatic," I said, and my voice came out steady and cold. "I'm being very specific and very clear. You've spent years making assumptions about my life and my success without ever asking for the actual facts. And now you're upset that your assumptions were wrong. But that's not my fault, and it's not my problem." I looked at Emma directly and said, "And I'm definitely not your emergency fund for poor planning. You had a $45,000 wedding that Mom and Dad paid for in full. You got $30,000 for your condo down payment. You have 2 lawyer incomes, and somehow you're $12,000 short on your honeymoon because you didn't budget properly. That's not a me problem." My father's face had shifted into defensive mode, and he said, "After everything we've done for you, this is how you respond when your sister needs help?" And I felt the last piece of my patience shatter cleanly. I looked at my father and felt something that had been coiled tight in my chest for years finally release. And I said, "Let's talk about everything you've done for me. Let's actually lay that out clearly so we're all working with the same facts." My voice came out level and cold, and I watched him draw back slightly, like he hadn't expected me to engage with that particular line of attack. Emma's undergraduate tuition at Northwestern, 4 years at $53,000 annually, you paid in full, that's $212,000. Her law school at Georgetown, 3 years at $62,000 per year with living expenses covered, that's another $186,000, so we're at $398,000 before we even get to the down payment on her condo, which was $30,000, or the wedding you just paid for in full at $45,000. We're now at $473,000 in direct financial support. I watched my mother's face go pale and continued, because the numbers were right there in my head, numbers I'd been quietly tracking for years without ever planning to weaponize them. But now they were the only language that seemed to matter. My undergraduate tuition at State, you contributed $5,000 total my freshman year, and told me I needed to figure out the rest. Because you'd already stretched yourselves thin with Emma's expenses, I took out $48,000 in student loans that I've been paying on for 10 years, and finally cleared 3 months ago. You've given me exactly $0 toward housing, $0 toward my career, $0 for graduate education, because I couldn't afford to go. The total direct financial support you've provided me in my entire adult life is $5,000. I let that sink in and watched Emma's face cycle through expressions she couldn't quite control. "So when you say, 'after everything we've done for you,' what you actually mean is after the bare minimum we provided while giving your sister nearly $500,000 in support, and that's fine, that was your choice to make. You clearly believed Emma's path was more worthy of investment, and you're entitled to spend your money however you want." My father tried to interrupt, but I kept going because I needed him to hear this, needed all of them to hear it. "But don't confuse your choices with my obligation. Don't pretend that $5,000 creates some kind of debt that means I owe Emma $12,000 now. The math doesn't work that way, and more importantly, the relationship doesn't work that way." I looked at Emma directly and said, "You've had every advantage, every bit of support, every benefit of their belief and investment, and you still somehow managed to overspend on your wedding by $12,000. That's not a crisis, that's poor planning, and it's definitely not my responsibility to fix." Emma's voice came out shrill when she said, "I can't believe how selfish you're being. This is family. This is your sister asking for help." And I felt something sharp and final click into place. "And I can't believe you see me as an ATM after years of treating me as less than. After years of dismissing my work and my choices and my life. You want my money, but you've never wanted my presence or my input or my success. You've only ever wanted me to stay small enough that you looked bigger by comparison. I stood up and my chair scraped against the hardwood floor of my parents' dining room, that sound cutting through the thick silence that had settled after my last words, and I reached for my purse on the side table because I was done. Completely and finally done with this conversation and this dynamic and this version of myself that kept showing up, hoping for something different. My mother's voice came sharp and high when she said, "If you walk out right now, you're choosing money over family. You're putting dollars ahead of the people who raised you and loved you." And I stopped with my hand on my purse and turned back to look at her directly. "No," I said, and my voice came out clear and strong, and I felt the truth of it in my chest. "I'm not choosing money over family. I'm choosing myself over people who only value me when they need something from me. There's a significant difference, and the fact that you can't see it is exactly the problem." I watched my mother's face crumple into an expression of wounded confusion, like I'd said something cruel instead of something true, and I continued, because they needed to hear this, because I needed to say it. "At your wedding," I said, looking at Emma, "during the father-daughter dance, Dad told that story about you winning the spelling bee in fourth grade and how he knew then you were destined for great things. He told it to a room full of 150 people. I won that same spelling bee in third grade, and he's never mentioned it once. Not once in 23 years. Emma's face flickered with something that might have been recognition, but I didn't stop. "During the toasts, your maid of honor talked about how you've always been the successful one, the one with direction and purpose, and she said it was obvious even in college that you were going somewhere. I was sitting at a table with her law school friends, and 3 of them asked me within an hour what I do, and when I answered, they all had that same expression, that sympathetic look people get when they think you're struggling but are too polite to say it directly." My father started to speak, but I held up my hand. At the rehearsal dinner, when people asked about family, Mom introduced Emma as my sister, the lawyer who just made partner track, and me as her other daughter, Sarah, who's doing some consulting work. The phrasing told everyone in that room exactly which daughter had value and which was just kind of there. I picked up my purse and settled it on my shoulder. "You made it absolutely clear at your wedding, and for years before that, I'm the unsuccessful one, the one still figuring things out, the one you hope finds her path eventually. So I'm really confused about why the unsuccessful one is expected to have $12,000 just lying around to fix the successful one's budgeting problems." Emma's voice came out choked when she said, "Some sister you are, some family member. When someone you love needs help, you help them." And I felt the last thread of obligation snap cleanly. "Some family you are," I said back. "When someone you supposedly love loses their job, you make jokes about it at dinner. When someone builds a business from nothing, you dismiss it as computer stuff. When someone succeeds despite getting none of your support, you only notice when you need their money." I walked toward the door, and my father called out, "Sarah, don't do this. Don't throw away your family over pride." But I kept walking, because it wasn't pride. It was finally understanding my worth with or without their recognition of it. My father called 4 days later, and I saw his name on my phone screen while I was sitting in a coffee shop reviewing contracts for a new client worth $92,000 annually. And I considered not answering, but something in me needed to hear what he would say now that the dust had settled and he'd had time to think about everything I'd laid out in their dining room. His voice came through cautious and measured when I answered, that tone he used when he was trying to manage a difficult situation at his accounting firm, and he said, "Sarah, I think we need to talk about what happened at brunch. Things got heated, and perhaps we all said things we didn't mean." And I noticed immediately that it wasn't an apology, just an acknowledgement that conflict had occurred with no ownership of who caused it or why. I kept my voice level when I said, "I meant everything I said, every word. Those weren't heat-of-the-moment statements, those were things I've been aware of for years." And I heard him take a breath like he was preparing for a negotiation. He tried a different angle, said, "Your mother is very upset. She feels like you attacked the family over money. She's having trouble understanding why you kept your success secret if you weren't planning to throw it in our faces eventually. And I felt that old familiar anger try to rise, but I pushed it down because I didn't need anger anymore. I just needed clarity. I didn't keep it secret to throw it in anyone's face, I said. I kept it private because sharing my life with you has only ever resulted in dismissal or comparison. I got tired of being made to feel small, so I stopped giving you opportunities to do it. He was quiet for a moment, and then said, "We never meant to make you feel that way. We've always been proud of both our daughters." But the words rang hollow because they were contradicted by years of evidence. I told him I appreciated the call, but I needed some space, that I wasn't interested in pretending the confrontation hadn't happened or smoothing things over before anyone had actually examined their behavior. And he said, "You're really going to let this divide the family?" Like I was the one who'd created the division instead of the one who'd finally named it. Emma sent a text 2 days after that, long and accusatory, saying I'd embarrassed her in front of her husband, that I'd made her wedding week about me and my grievances, that she'd always known I was jealous, but she hadn't realized how deep it went. And I read it twice and then deleted it without responding because there was nothing to say to someone who could ask me for $12,000 and then accuse me of making things about myself. My mother went a different route entirely, calling my Aunt Linda and apparently painting me as having had some kind of breakdown or crisis of character. But Aunt Linda called me directly and listened to the whole story and said, "Honey, I've watched them do this to you your whole life. I'm glad you finally said something." And that validation from someone who'd witnessed the pattern meant more than I'd expected. 3 months later, I stood in my new condo on the 16th floor with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the downtown skyline, boxes mostly unpacked, furniture I'd chosen carefully arranged in spaces that were entirely mine, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years, which was complete peace with my choices. The agency had landed a Fortune 500 client the week before, a contract worth $230,000 annually, and my business partner and I had celebrated with expensive champagne and the knowledge that we'd built something real and sustainable. My parents sent a card to my new address, stiff and formal. "Congratulations on your new home," in my mother's careful handwriting with both their signatures but no personal message, and I put it in a drawer without much feeling either way, because their approval or lack of it had stopped being the measure of my worth. Emma's social media showed her honeymoon photos from the scaled-back trip they'd apparently taken, and mutual acquaintances told me she'd been telling people I'd refused to help family in a time of need. But I didn't correct the narrative because the people who mattered knew the truth and the people who didn't weren't worth the energy. I wasn't bitter and I wasn't angry. I was just free, in a way I'd never been when I was still trying to earn their recognition, still performing the role of the lesser daughter, hoping that eventually they'd see me clearly. I thought about reaching out sometimes, wondered if there was a version of reconciliation that didn't require me to diminish myself. But then I'd remember my mother's face when she'd suggested I put their luxury honeymoon on my credit card, or my father's casual dismissal of my work as computer stuff, and I'd know that nothing had fundamentally changed in their perception. They'd just learned I had resources they'd underestimated. On a Saturday morning, 6 months after the confrontation, I sat in my living room with coffee and watched the sun come up over the city, light spilling across the hardwood floors I'd chosen, and the art I'd bought, and the life I'd built entirely on my own terms. And I understood with complete clarity that I'd done the right thing, that choosing myself over their dysfunction wasn't selfish. It was necessary. It was survival. It was the only way forward that didn't require me to keep pretending I was less than I was. My worth had never depended on their recognition, and it never would, and that knowledge settled into my bones like something solid and unshakable, and I was finally, completely, peacefully free.